You finish your shift at the factory. It's payday. You grab your wages, a thick stack of banknotes, and you run. Not walk, run. Because if you don't spend that money within the next few hours, it will be worth less. Not a little less, a lot less. By tomorrow morning, that stack of cash might not even buy you a loaf of bread. This was daily life in Germany in 1923, a country where people burned banknotes in their stoves, not as a protest, not as art, but because the paper was literally cheaper than firewood. A country where a cup of coffee ordered at a cafe cost 5,000 marks, and by the time you finished it, the second cup cost 7,000. A country where a loaf of bread that cost 160 marks in 1922 cost 200 billion marks by late 1923. This is the story of the Weimar Hyperinflation, one of the most catastrophic economic collapses in modern history. And the story doesn't end in 1923, it ends in 1945. Because the seeds of everything that followed, the anger, the desperation, the man who exploited it all, were planted right here. Let's talk about it. To understand Weimar hyperinflation, you need to go back to 1914, because the inflation didn't start in 1923, it started the moment Germany entered the First World War. Here's the thing about wars, they're expensive. Incredibly expensive, and governments have basically three ways to pay for them. You raise taxes, you borrow money, or you print it. Germany chose to print and borrow. The German government was convinced the war would be short, a few months, they thought. Germany would win, take reparations from the losers, and pay everything back. Easy. So they abandoned the gold standard, meaning the mark was no longer backed by actual gold, and started financing the war through debt. By 1918, Germany had accumulated 156 billion marks in war debt. Prices had already doubled during the war years alone. Then Germany lost, and suddenly everything fell apart at once. The Kaiser abdicated, revolution broke out. The Weimar Republic was born into chaos, a brand new democratic government inheriting a broken economy, a humiliated military, and a furious public. And then came the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty did several things that economically devastated Germany. It stripped Germany of territory, including some of its most industrially productive land. It took its colonies, removing access to cheap raw materials. It reduced its military to almost nothing, and, most critically, it imposed reparations. The total reparations bill? 132 billion gold marks. In today's money, somewhere above $500 billion. Annual payments were set at around 2.5% of Germany's GDP every single year. For a country already broken by 4 years of war and debt, this was not a recovery plan. This was a slow suffocation. Here's where the economic logic gets interesting and tragic. The Weimar government had a problem. It owed enormous amounts of money to foreign creditors in gold-backed currency, but it was collecting taxes in a currency that was already losing value. The gap between what it owed and what it had was widening every month. So what did it do? It printed more money. Now, on the surface, this seems like complete madness, and it was, but there was a twisted logic to it. Domestic war debts, money owed to German citizens, were denominated in paper marks. So if you inflate the currency enough, those debts become worthless in real terms. Germany was essentially inflating away its own domestic debt. The problem is, you can't control inflation once it starts. It's like pushing a boulder downhill. Gravity takes over. Before World War I, one US dollar bought about 4 German marks. By 1920, it bought 70. By late 1921, it bought 180. There were moments of stabilization, brief windows where it looked like things might be under control. But then came 1923 and the Ruhr. January 1923. Germany had fallen behind on its reparations payments, specifically coal deliveries. France and Belgium had had enough. They sent troops into the Ruhr Valley, Germany's most important industrial region, to seize resources directly.
The Ruhr wasn't just any region, it was the heart of German industry. Coal, steel, manufacturing, all of it concentrated in this one area. Losing it, even temporarily, was like someone cutting off your oxygen supply. The German government's response? Passive resistance. It told workers in the Ruhr to do nothing, don't cooperate with the occupiers, go on strike, shut everything down. And 2 million workers did exactly that. But here's the economic catastrophe hiding inside that decision. Those 2 million striking workers still needed to be paid. The Weimar government was subsidizing a general strike with money it didn't have. The only solution? Print more. By mid-1923, Germany's central banks were running more than 30 paper factories, nearly 1,800 banknote printing presses, and 133 separate companies, all just to produce enough physical cash to keep up with demand. Think about that. The money was being printed so fast that the physical production of banknotes had become one of Germany's largest industries. By April 1923, the government was spending more than 7 times what it collected in revenue every single month. And then the exchange rate went completely vertical. Let me give you the numbers, because they're so extreme they almost stop feeling real. January 1923, $1 cost 17,000 marks. June 1923, 192,000 marks. October 1923, 170 billion marks. November 1923, 4.2 trillion marks for $1 in 10 months. A loaf of bread that cost 160 marks at the end of 1922 cost 200 billion marks by late 1923. That's an increase of more than 1 billion%. A Berlin resident named Betty Scholem wrote a letter to her son in October 1923. She noted that just sending the letter cost 15 million marks, and that the price would rise to 30 million 2 days later. Workers negotiated to be paid twice a day, once in the morning and once at lunch, so their wives could rush to the shops before the afternoon prices kicked in. Prices were rising by the hour. People burned banknotes in their stoves, not symbolically, literally. Wood and coal were more expensive in paper mark terms. A bundle of notes was cheaper fuel than actual firewood. Children played with stacks of billion-mark notes like building blocks. Some people made dresses out of banknotes, not as a fashion statement. They simply had so much paper money and it was worth so little that this was a reasonable use for it. And here's one of the cruelest aspects. Not everyone suffered equally. Here's the part that often gets left out of the hyperinflation story. Some people did very well out of it. If you had debt, hyperinflation wiped it out. You could take out a large loan in 1921 marks, and by 1923, pay it back in marks worth almost nothing, effectively free money. Industrialists with real assets, factories, land, machinery, saw those assets hold their value in real terms, even as currency collapsed. Some actually used the chaos to buy up rivals and expand their empires for almost nothing. Farmers were in a relatively strong position. They had food, and food had real value. They could barter, trade in foreign currency with those who had it, or simply refuse to sell for paper marks at all. But the middle class? Destroyed. The German middle class had done what responsible people do. They saved. They put money in the bank. They bought government bonds. They invested in paper assets.
And hyperinflation turned all of that to dust. Life savings wiped out overnight. Pension funds rendered worthless. Everything they had worked for, gone. Pensioners starved. People who had retired comfortably were suddenly destitute, their fixed incomes buying almost nothing. The elderly had no way to renegotiate, no way to catch up. Shopkeepers couldn't restock fast enough. Farmers refused to sell food for paper currency. Food riots broke out. People marched into the countryside to loot farms. And into this fury, into this desperation, stepped the politicians, including one who had just tried and failed to seize power in a Munich beer hall. November 8 and 9, 1923, the
the absolute peak of the hyperinflation, Munich, Germany. A group of ultranationalists, army officers, and a charismatic speaker named Adolf Hitler attempted a coup. They called it the Beer Hall Putsch. It failed. Hitler was arrested. He went to prison, and in prison he wrote Mein Kampf. The putsch failed, but the conditions that made it possible did not disappear. The Weimar Republic was blamed for everything: the lost war, the humiliating peace treaty, the economic catastrophe. The middle class, the people who had lost their savings, their security, their sense of stability, became deeply hostile to the democratic government that had presided over their ruin. Hyperinflation didn't directly cause Hitler's rise to power. That came later, after the Great Depression hit in 1929. But it planted something: a deep structural distrust of democratic institutions, a trauma that never fully healed, a readiness to believe that someone, somewhere, was responsible for what had happened and needed to be punished for it. And when the next crisis came, that readiness was still there. Now here's the remarkable thing. After all of this, after years of chaos and suffering, the hyperinflation was ended, not gradually, almost overnight. In November 1923, a new currency was introduced, the Rentenmark. One Rentenmark was worth 1 trillion old paper marks. The new currency wasn't backed by gold. Germany didn't have gold. It was backed by land, agricultural and industrial property mortgaged to the state. The architect of this solution was a banker named Hjalmar Schacht. He restricted the money supply. He imposed brutal austerity on government spending. He stabilized the exchange rate. And it worked. The inflation stopped almost immediately. This is actually one of the most instructive parts of the whole story. Hyperinflation isn't an unstoppable force of nature. It's a consequence of specific policy choices, and it can be ended by different policy choices. The price, of course, was enormous pain, but the mechanism was policy, not inevitability. By 1924, the Dawes Plan brought in American loans. Reparations were restructured. Germany's economy began to stabilize. The mid-1920s actually brought real prosperity to Germany, the Golden Twenties. But the scars remained. Weimar hyperinflation was not a one-off historical accident. The basic pattern has repeated itself multiple times since 1923. Zimbabwe in the 2000s. Inflation peaked at an almost incomprehensible 89.7 sextillion% per month in November 2008. The central bank eventually issued a $100 trillion note. Venezuela in the 2010s. Annual inflation reached over 1,000,000% by 2018. People carried cash in bags and weighed it rather than counted it. Argentina has experienced recurring hyperinflation crises throughout its modern history and is still dealing with severe inflation today. And Turkey, right next door, saw its lira lose roughly 80% of its value against the dollar between 2018 and 2023. Every single time, the basic ingredients are the same: a government that spends far more than it earns, a central bank that prints money to cover the gap, a loss of public confidence in the currency, and then the spiral. Once people believe money will be worth less tomorrow, they spend it today, which drives prices up, which drives the belief, which drives spending. The lesson of Weimar isn't just economic, it's political. Hyperinflation doesn't just destroy savings, it destroys trust. Trust in institutions, trust in government, trust in the future. And when people lose that trust, they look for someone to blame, and they find someone. That's the most dangerous part of this story, and that's the part that keeps repeating. Here's an interesting footnote to all of this. Germany today has one of the most inflation-phobic central banks in the world. The Bundesbank, Germany's central bank, has had an almost fanatical commitment to price stability ever since World War II. That's not a coincidence. It's a direct inheritance of 1923. The trauma of hyperinflation was so deep, so formative, that it shaped German monetary policy for a century. When other European countries were fine with a little more inflation to boost growth, Germany said no every time. A former German economics minister once said, "One lesson of history is that when money goes bad, everything goes bad." He was talking about 1923, but he could have been talking about any number of times since. The Weimar Hyperinflation is not ancient history. It's a live instruction manual for what happens when governments lose control of money. And when they do, it's never just an economic crisis. It always becomes something much worse. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps the channel grow. See you in the next one.